Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with your last lecture for muscular physiology. In this lecture, we'll look at types of myofibers and their features. And there's three different types: slow twitch, fast twitch, but two types of fast twitch, oxidative and glycolytic. And as you can see from the cartoon, we use these different muscle cells for different activities. So for slow twitch, we'll use that for sustained activities, and fast twitch for short bursts of intense activity. So here is a list of the three different types of muscle fibers, and they're categorized the way they are: fast glycolytic, fast oxidative, and slow oxidative, based on their size, the speed with which they can twitch or contract, and third, what method do they use to produce ATP? So we're going to categorize each one of these things and relate it to the different types of muscle fibers. So we've already talked a little bit about how the size of muscle cells varies. It depends on the diameter. So I talked about this in the last lecture. There are small diameter fibers, medium-sized, and then large. And it turns out that in small motor units, there's mainly small fibers, and in large motor units, there's mainly large fibers. And we're going to relate these sizes to how fast these cells are able to twitch as well. So let's look at the speed of twitch and how it varies. So some muscle fibers or muscle cells are considered fast twitch because after a stimulation they reach maximal muscle tension quickly. Others are called slow twitch fibers, like those in the soleus muscle. It's a synergistic muscle in your calf, and it takes a long time, I guess, relative, still milliseconds, to reach maximum muscle tension. Now, of course, muscles, whole muscles, have combinations of fast twitch fibers and slow twitch fibers. For example, I show here in the gastrocnemius that it essentially has both in equal numbers. So that particular muscle reaches maximum muscle tension intermediately between the time it takes for the lateral rectus, an eye muscle, to reach maximum tension, and the soleus to reach maximum tension. Now, why are some fibers considered, fast twitch, and why are some slow twitch? I mean, other than the obvious, we see how fast they contract. Why? It's because they vary in how fast calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and how fast ATP is broken down on the myosin head right before the cross bridge forms. So fast twitch fibers, the contractions are quick and short. Calcium is released quickly, and ATP hydrolysis happens quickly. Slow twitch fibers, contractions, of course, like in the soleus, are slow and long. And in this case, calcium is released slowly and ATP hydrolysis occurs slowly. So presumably the myosin head, which acts as an enzyme, is a little bit different in slow twitch fibers versus fast twitch fibers. And probably the calcium channels on the sarcoplasmic reticulum are as well. Now, the difference in how each type of muscle fiber makes ATP, will make us kind of look back at ATP synthesis and the different steps involved in that. So you may recall that glycolysis starts with glucose and it ends with pyruvate, and then it can also, the pyruvate can be broken down into lactic acid through a process called fermentation. And you might remember that aerobic respiration involves taking that pyruvate into the mitochondria, allowing the Krebs cycle to occur and the electron transport chain to produce more ATP. So what we see is that fast twitch fibers are generally adapted for glycolysis, which generates ATP quickly, and then lactic acid might be formed from pyruvate, and so there'd be fermentation as well. Now there are some fast twitch fibers that can also do aerobic respiration. Those we're going to see are the intermediate types, but generally fast twitch fibers for now we're just going to consider glycolysis. Slow twitch fibers are called oxidative fibers because they are highly adapted for aerobic respiration. So we need to understand what these adaptations are. Why do fast twitch fibers use glycolysis whereas slow twitch fibers use aerobic respiration? It has to do with the adaptations present in skeletal muscle cells. So we're going to go through what these 4 things are and then look at fast and slow twitch muscle fibers to see who's got which of these adaptations. So skeletal muscle cells contain a local energy source or carbon source, glycogen. And there's much more glycogen present in fast twitch fibers than there is in slow twitch fibers. That glycogen is needed so that it can be broken down in order to make ATP. The energy harnessed from the breakdown of glycogen will go into producing ATP. Now to make ATP we have to have phosphate around. So another adaptation in skeletal muscle cells is a local source of phosphate. This compound is called creatine phosphate. It turns out that all muscle cells have about the same amount of creatine phosphate. So that's not going to be any different between fast and slow twitch fibers. Thirdly, skeletal muscle cells have the ability to locally store oxygen on a molecule by binding to a molecule called myoglobin. It's a lot like hemoglobin in our red blood cells, if you're familiar with that. Slow twitch fibers have a lot more myoglobin than general fast twitch fibers do. And then lastly, the ATP synthesis will vary. The method of ATP synthesis will vary depending on the enzymes present. So aerobic respiration is used, as I mentioned, in slow twitch fibers, and anaerobic glycolysis is used by fast twitch fibers. So let's first look at glycogen in a little bit more detail. As I mentioned, fast twitch fibers store more glycogen than slow twitch fibers. This picture of a muscle has been stained for glycogen and myoglobin. The glycogen is pink and the myoglobin is dark red. So the glycogen is seen to be abundant, the pink fascicle here, in slow twitch fibers. I guess it's not a fascicle, it's a cell, sorry. And the slow oxidative fibers are dark red and they have a lot more myoglobin. Okay, secondly, let's look a little bit at creatine phosphate. This is a local source of phosphate that can be used to make ATP. And it's present in all the myofibers type myofiber types, it's converted into creatine when the phosphate's taken off. And there's an enzyme called creatine kinase that takes off the phosphate and transfers it to ADP to produce ATP. So this doesn't require oxygen. It doesn't require the electron transport chain at all. So we haven't, used any energy to do this. Now there is a clinical correlation with this creatine. Increased amounts of creatine and creatine kinase both are released into the blood when there's some sort of muscle damage, even in heart muscle damage, like myocardial infarction or muscular dystrophy, even with kidney disease. So when clinicians suspect muscle damage, either heart or skeletal muscles, they can order a blood test and measure for levels of creatine and creatine kinase. Okay, let's look at myoglobin a little bit. Myoglobin, the compound is shown here. I don't know if this reminds you of hemoglobin or not, but there's, chains of polypeptides and oxygen is bound in the middle, just like hemoglobin. This myoglobin compound is reddish brown because it's got some iron in it, and it's present in the cytoplasm of our muscle cells. The reason it's important to skeletal muscle is that if the skeletal muscle can locally store oxygen, it's not as dependent on a continuous blood supply, oxygenated blood, during muscle contraction. Now, obviously, blood flow increases to muscles during a sympathetic response or anytime there's activity and the heart rate goes up and there's vasodilation. It's true that there will probably be increased blood flow, but sometimes the need for oxygen even outdoes what's available in the blood, and so this local source enables the muscle cells to continue to make ATP by aerobic respiration even when blood flow is not adequate or the supply of oxygen from blood flow is not adequate. Okay, the next thing to look at has to do with ATP synthesis. I bet you thought you were done with this. Let's just review a little bit here. Oxygen is not required for the first step of making ATP, which is glycolysis. You don't need oxygen for that. But you do need to have some sort of carbon-based compound, and glucose is the easiest for muscle cells to break down. So that glucose can come from the blood, or it could come from the muscle's cytoplasm in the form of glycogen, which is just a chain of glucose. So this glucose is broken down into pyruvate, and that yields a certain amount of ATP. Not a lot, but some. Now, if the pyruvate is converted into lactic acid, you get a little extra ATP, but not a lot. So that's all without oxygen. If instead you want to make more ATP, you need oxygen. And what happens is the pyruvate goes into the mitochondria, or the skeletal muscle cells can start using fatty acids. And first, there's beta oxidation. That's probably not something that we need to review at this point. But the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain both occur in the mitochondria, and they both require oxygen. So you'll get oxygen production, carbon dioxide, but most important, you're going to get ATP. You also get heat. That's where most of your body temperature comes from your skeletal muscles generating ATP and the byproduct of heat. So the bottom line is a lot more ATP can be made if you use oxygen. Okay, let's look at a summary of the different myofiber types related to all those adaptations that we talked about. And when we do this, when we're talking about myofiber types, we're talking about cells. Okay, there's different types of cells. And I think it's important to remember that all muscles contain some of each type of cell. So let's start with the slow ones, the slow oxidative fibers. So these are the ones that have the nice slow twitch. Okay, they're small in diameter, so they tend to be present in smaller motor units. They are recruited first. They generate less muscle tension. So you're going to need more of them to get muscle tension great enough for whole muscle contraction. They have slow twitch myosin, so that means that they break down ATP slowly. They're best adapted for aerobic respiration, which is why they're called oxidative. They have a lot of mitochondria. That's for the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. They have a lot of myoglobin. That's the O2 storage. And a rich blood supply. But they do not store much glycogen. And they are oxygen dependent, of course. So they're best suited for endurance type activities, not strong bursts of intense activity. Now let's look at the other extreme, fast glycolytic fibers. So in this case, these are fibers like in the lateral rectus that reach tension quickly. They have short bursts, short twitches. So these are larger cells, so they're associated with larger motor units. They're recruited last when a muscle contracts. I'll show it over here. They have fast twitch myosin. That means ATP breakdown happens quickly. Not very many mitochondria. Not a lot of myoglobin, so low O2, but that's okay because they're not going to use oxygen anyway. They're going to use glycolysis. They're going to use glycolysis to make ATP. So they have a high glycogen content though. I guess that compensates a little bit. They can do glycolysis frequently. And these are best suited for activities that involve short-term intense actions like sprinting, weightlifting, maybe not sustaining the weight, but getting the weight to the point where you want to hold it, hitting a baseball. Now there's this funny kind of this funny kind of fiber that's intermediate between the two. They're called fast oxidative, and they're intermediate in every way. That is, in their size, and they're present in both types of motor units, large and small. They're recruited second, and they generate an intermediate amount of force, and their twitches, of course, are intermediate in length. They do have fast twitch myosin, so that means they can break down ATP quickly, which is more like glycolytic, but they're adapted for aerobic respiration if they need to use it. So they can use glycolysis. They have some glycogen stores, not as much as fast glycolytic, so they can use glycolysis. But they can switch to aerobic respiration too when O2 levels are fine. Many mitochondria, so they can do the Krebs cycle, and they can do the electron transport chain. They store oxygen locally, and they have a rich blood supply. So when we do our live lecture, We're going to summarize all of these and work on a worksheet so that it's not so confusing to you. But for now, just remember there's 3 types of fibers. There's slow oxidative fibers that are small, and they generally use aerobic respiration. There are fast glycolytic fibers. They're large in size, and they use anaerobic glycolysis to make ATP. And then there's this intermediate type. Intermediate in every way. Intermediate in size, and they can use either aerobic respiration or glycolysis. Thank you very much. That's your last lecture for A&P1.